pressed her face against the cold metal bars of her cage, watching the auction floor below. Hundreds of aliens filled the massive chamber, their voices creating a constant buzz of negotiation and cruelty. The slave market was the largest in this sector of the galaxy, and today she would be sold like a piece of equipment. Her blue-scaled skin bore the marks of countless beatings. The collar around her neck hummed with electric energy, ready to deliver pain at the touch of a button. She was one of the last of her kind. Her people had been peaceful researchers, studying the mysteries of space until the hegemony destroyed her 3 years ago. The auctioneer, a massive creature with 4 arms and yellow eyes, pointed at her cage. Next item, a rare female, excellent for mining operations or personal service. Bidding starts at 5,000 credits. Closed her eyes, trying to remember better times. Her father teaching her about stellar formations. Her mother singing the old songs of their people. Her younger brother asking endless questions about everything. All gone now, turned to ash when the hegemony bombers came. 6,000, called out a voice from the crowd. 7,000, another shouted. She opened her eyes and looked down at the bidders. Most were the usual types, overseers looking for cheap labor, merchants who would work her to death in their factories, or worse, the pleasure dealers who saw her kind as exotic entertainment. 10,000 credits, a new voice said, quieter than the others but somehow cutting through the noise. Looked toward the sound and saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Standing at the back of the crowd was a creature she had only heard about in stories. A human. The bipedal species was legendary throughout the galaxy, though few had ever seen one. He was tall but not massive like the other species. His skin was pale, almost pink, and he had hair the color of dried grass. What struck her most were his eyes. They were blue like deep water and seemed to hold both kindness and terrible determination. 15,000, the human said, stepping forward. The crowd murmured in surprise. Humans were known to be fierce warriors, but they rarely appeared in slave markets. Most aliens gave the human space as he moved through the crowd, their survival instincts warning them to be careful around his species. A fat merchant raised his hand. 20,000, I need workers for my asteroid mines. The human looked directly at through the bars. For a moment their eyes met, and she saw something there she had not seen in 3 years: compassion. Not pity, but genuine care for another living being. 50,000 credits, the human said without looking away from her. The entire auction hall fell silent. 50,000 credits was enough to buy a small starship. The auctioneer's yellow eyes widened with greed and excitement. 50,000 going once, the auctioneer called out, looking around the suddenly quiet crowd. No one else spoke. The amount was far beyond what any slave was worth, even a rare one like. Going twice, the auctioneer continued. Found herself holding her breath. She did not know why this human wanted to buy her, but something deep in her spirit told her that her fate would be different with him than with any of the others. Sold to the human for 50,000 credits. The crowd began to disperse, many aliens casting curious glances at the human as they left. Watched as he approached the payment station, pulling out a credit chip without hesitation. The transaction was completed quickly, the never-questioned payment, regardless of the buyer's species or motivations. 2 guards approached her cage with shock prods and restraints. "Come on, Scaleskin," one of them grunted. "Your new master wants to collect his property." They unlocked her cage and roughly pulled her out. Her legs were weak from months of confinement, and she stumbled as they dragged her toward the collection area. The electric collar around her neck sparked, sending a warning jolt through her nervous system. The human was waiting in a small room behind the auction floor. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had expected. Humans were known throughout the galaxy as one of the most dangerous species when provoked, but this one seemed calm and patient. "Here's your purchase," one of the guards said, shoving forward. "Collar remote is included. She's been well trained, won't give you any trouble." The guard handed the human a small device, the controller for her shock collar. The human took it without comment, his blue eyes studying her face rather than examining her like a piece of merchandise. "Thank you," the human said simply. "I'll take it from here." The guards left and suddenly found herself alone with her new owner. She kept her head down, as she had been trained to do. Speaking without permission would result in punishment, and she had learned that lesson many times over. "What's your name?" the human asked gently. Looked up in surprise. Masters rarely asked for names. They usually assigned numbers or simply called their slaves by their species designation. I am called," she said quietly, her voice rough from disuse. He repeated, and somehow the name sounded different when he said it, more real. "My name is, I'm going to get you out of here." She stared at him in confusion. "Master, I do not understand." Shook his head. "I'm not your master, and you're not going to be anyone's slave anymore." Before she could respond, he raised the collar remote and pressed several buttons. Instead of sending pain through her body, the device around her neck clicked and fell to the floor with a metallic clang. Gasped and reached up to touch her throat. For the first time in 3 years, her neck was free. The constant weight and threat of the collar was gone. She looked down at the device lying on the floor, then back up with wonder and disbelief. "How did you?" she began. "I've been studying hegemony slave technology for months," explained. "The override codes aren't that hard to crack once you understand the system." "But why?" asked, still not quite believing what was happening. "Why would you spend so much to free me?" His expression grew serious. "Because slavery is wrong, and because your people deserve better than what the hegemony did to them." Tears began to form in his eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her basic kindness, let alone acknowledged the tragedy of her people's destruction. "Come on," said, gesturing toward a door at the back of the room. "My ship is docked nearby. We need to leave before anyone starts asking questions about why I disabled that collar." As they walked through the corridors of the space station, found herself stealing glances at her rescuer. Humans were legendary warriors, but the stories also spoke of their strange sense of justice and their willingness to fight for the weak. She had always thought such tales were exaggerations, but now she was seeing it firsthand. They passed other slaves being led by their new masters and felt a pang of guilt at her own freedom, but seemed to read her thoughts. "We'll come back for the others," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." The docking bay was crowded with ships of various sizes and designs, led her to a medium-sized vessel that looked fast and well-armed. The name Defiance was painted on the hull in human script. As they boarded the ship, felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Just hours ago, she had been preparing herself for a life of misery and eventual death. Now she was walking onto a human starship as a free being. The ship's interior was clean and functional, with none of the opulent decorations favored by most alien species. Led her to a small cabin with a real bed, clean clothes, and even a small window showing the stars beyond. "This is your room," he said. "You can rest, eat, do whatever you want. The door doesn't lock from the outside." Sat carefully on the edge of the bed, still hardly believing this was real. "What happens now?" Leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "Now we work on shutting down slave markets like this one. The hegemony thinks they can buy and sell people like cargo, but they're wrong. Every being deserves freedom, and I'm going to make sure they get it." "But you are just one human," said. "The hegemony has thousands of ships, millions of soldiers." Smiled, and for the first time, saw why humans were feared throughout the galaxy. It was not just their physical capabilities. It was their absolute refusal to accept defeat when fighting for something they believed in. "I'm not alone," he said. "There are others like me, scattered throughout the galaxy, humans who decided that slavery ends now, regardless of what it costs us." As the ship lifted off from the station and jumped into hyperspace, looked out her window at the swirling colors of faster-than-light travel. For the first time in 3 years, she was moving toward hope instead of despair. In the days that followed, treated her like an equal rather than rescued property. He asked her about her people's history, their culture, their knowledge of stellar phenomena. He was particularly interested in navigation techniques, which had been far superior to most species' methods. "Your people were explorers," he said one evening as they shared a meal in the ship's small dining area. "The galaxy lost something precious when the hegemony destroyed your world." Nodded sadly. "We believed that knowledge should be shared, that the universe was meant to be explored together by all thinking beings. The hegemony saw that as weakness." "It wasn't weakness," said firmly. "It was civilization, and that's what we're fighting to restore." As they traveled through space, began to understand the scope of his mission. He was part of a loose network of humans and other species who were actively working to undermine the hegemony's slave trade. They rescued individuals when possible, but their larger goal was to destroy the entire system. Every slave market we shut down, every shipment we intercept, every overseer we eliminate, it all adds up, explained. The hegemony's power depends on fear and the assumption that resistance is futile. We're proving them wrong, one operation at a time. Found herself wanting to be part of this resistance. Her people's knowledge of space navigation could be valuable, and she had intimate experience with hegemony operations from the perspective of their victims. "I want to help," she told one day. "I want to fight back." Studied her for a long moment. "It's dangerous work, and it means putting yourself back in contact with the very people who enslaved you." "I know," she replied, "but I cannot live free while others suffer as I did. My people believed in justice, and I want to honor that belief." Smiled and extended his hand to her in the human gesture of agreement. "Welcome to the resistance." As she shook his hand, felt something she had thought was lost forever: purpose. She was no longer just a survivor trying to endure each day. She was a fighter, preparing to strike back at the forces that had destroyed her world and enslaved her people. The human had given her more than freedom. He had given her a chance to reclaim her dignity and make her people's sacrifice meaningful. And that, she realized, was the most precious gift anyone could receive. 3 months had passed since rescued from the slave market, and she had become an invaluable member of his resistance cell. Her knowledge of navigation techniques allowed them to travel through hyperspace routes that hegemony ships couldn't follow, giving them a significant tactical advantage. The ship Defiance approached the station, a massive trading hub built inside a hollowed-out asteroid. Intelligence reports indicated that a major slave auction was scheduled for the next day, with over 200 captives from a dozen different species. Among them were reportedly several children survivors from a transport ship that had been captured while fleeing the destruction of there. "The security will be heavy," said as they studied the station's layout on the bridge. "The hegemony has 3 cruisers docked there, plus whatever private security the auction house employs." Traced the station's corridors with her finger, her blue scales shimmering under the display lights. "Here," she said, pointing to a maintenance tunnel that connected to the holding cells. "These passages were designed for emergency evacuation. Most species cannot fit through them but are naturally flexible." "You're thinking of going in alone?" asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "I can reach the children and prepare them for extraction," explained. "If they see another, they will trust me immediately, but if they see humans or other aliens, they might panic and alert the guards." Nodded slowly. The plan was risky, but it made tactical sense. Children had been taught from birth to fear other species after the hegemony's attacks began. Seeing a familiar face would calm them and make the rescue more likely to succeed. "What about the other prisoners?" asked the team's demolitions expert. She was a human woman from the outer colonies whose family had been killed when slavers raided her settlement. "We can't save the kids and leave everyone else behind." "We won't," assured her. "Once has the children ready, we'll create a distraction large enough to evacuate everyone, but we need those kids calm and cooperative first." The plan they developed was complex but carefully coordinated. Would infiltrate the station through the maintenance tunnels while the rest of the team positioned themselves around the auction facility. When she gave the signal, they would simultaneously attack the security systems, power grid, and communications array. As Night's cycle began on the station, made her way through the cramped maintenance passages. Her people's natural flexibility allowed her to navigate turns and obstacles that would have been impossible for most other species. The tunnels were dark and filled with the constant hum of life support systems. She found the access panel to the holding area and carefully removed it. Below her, she could see rows of cages filled with beings from across the galaxy. The sight brought back painful memories of her own captivity, but she pushed those feelings aside and focused on the mission. In the third row of cages, she spotted them 5 children huddled together in obvious fear. The youngest looked to be barely 10 years old, while the oldest might have been 16. All of them bore the marks of rough handling during their capture. Dropped silently into the corridor between the cages. The other prisoners looked at her in surprise, but she gestured for silence as she approached the children. "My little ones," she whispered in their native language, I am of the Silver Coast clan. I have come to take you home. The children's eyes widened in amazement and relief. The oldest, a girl with intricate scale patterns that marked her as nobility, spoke first. Lady, we thought we were the only ones left. The raiders said they had killed all the adults. Many of us survive, lied gently. In truth, she had only encountered 3 other in her travels but these children needed hope more than harsh reality. We have found powerful allies who fight against the hegemony. Humans? The girl asked, her voice filled with the awe that the name inspired throughout the galaxy. Yes, child. They have sworn to end the slave trade and they do not break their promises. Quickly explained the rescue plan to the children, speaking in their native tongue to avoid alerting any guards who might be listening. She also whispered instructions to some of the other prisoners, letting them know that freedom was coming if they stayed calm and followed directions. 20 minutes later, she activated her communicator and sent a coded signal to. The response was immediate and devastating. Explosions rocked the station as charges destroyed the main power generators. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a hellish red glow. Alarms blared as the security systems went offline one by one. And his team struck the guard positions with precision and overwhelming force. Humans were famous throughout the galaxy for their tactical brilliance and absolute ruthlessness in combat. The guards, mostly mercenaries hired for their intimidating appearance rather than their fighting skills, found themselves facing opponents who moved like shadows and struck like lightning. Use the chaos to begin opening cages. The locking mechanisms were electronic and failed when the power went down, allowing her to free dozens of prisoners within minutes. The children stayed close to her as she had instructed, while other freed slaves began helping their fellow captives escape. This way, she called out in several languages, leading the growing crowd toward the emergency exits. Freedom is this way. But as they reached the main corridor, they found their path blocked by a squad of hegemony soldiers in full combat armor. The lead soldier, a massive with cybernetic implants, raised his energy weapon. Halt escaped property, he commanded. Return to your cages immediately or face termination. The freed slaves hesitated, fear overcoming their brief taste of hope. Many began to step backward, ready to surrender rather than face the soldiers' weapons. Then appeared behind the soldiers like an avenging spirit. The squad leader had barely begun to turn when struck him with that cut through armor plating like paper. The other soldiers spun to face this new threat, but found themselves caught between the humans' assault and a crowd of angry former slaves who suddenly remembered that they outnumbered their captors 50-1. The battle was brief but decisive. The soldiers' weapons were designed for crowd control, not close-quarters combat against a determined opponent. Moved through them like a force of nature, his blade worked precise and lethal. Meanwhile, the freed slaves overwhelmed the survivors with sheer numbers and 3 years of accumulated rage. Move, 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 shouted as the last soldier fell. We have maybe 10 minutes before reinforcements arrive. The evacuation proceeded smoothly from that point, had prepared multiple escape routes, and the team had positioned several stolen transport ships at strategic docking bays. Within 8 minutes, over 200 former slaves were aboard various vessels and preparing for departure. Found herself on the bridge of the Defiance with the 5 children gathered around her. They stared in amazement at the human technology and the efficiency of crew. Lady, the oldest girl asked as they jumped into hyperspace, are all humans like Captain? Looked at, who was coordinating with the other escape ships to ensure everyone reached safety. His calm competence and absolute dedication to helping others represented everything she had come to respect about his species. Not all, she answered honestly, but enough of them, enough to make a difference. As the rescue fleet traveled through hyperspace, began the complex task of finding homes for the freed slaves. Some had families they could return to, others chose to join the resistance, and many simply wanted to find peaceful worlds where they could rebuild their lives. The children presented a special challenge. With their destroyed and their people scattered, they had no obvious destination, but had been thinking about this problem for months. There's a human colony in the Centaurus sector, he explained to New Geneva. The colonists have been asking for help with stellar navigation and space sciences. Your people's knowledge would be invaluable to them, and they'd provide a safe environment for the children to grow up. Humans would accept refugees? Asked, surprised by the generosity of the offer. These humans would, said firmly. They're descendants of refugees themselves. Their grandparents fled Earth during the corporate wars, so they understand what it means to lose everything and start over. The journey to New Geneva took 2 weeks, during which worked with the children to help them process their trauma and prepare for life in a human community. She was amazed by their resilience. Young adapted quickly to new situations, a trait that had helped her species become such accomplished explorers. When they arrived at New Geneva, they were greeted by Dr. Sarah, the colony's administrator. She was a middle-aged human woman with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put the children at ease. "Welcome to New Geneva," Doctor said in surprisingly good. She had been studying their language since first contacted her about the refugees. "We've prepared housing for you in the university district, and our children are very excited to meet you." The children were settled into comfortable apartments near the colony's research facilities, where they would attend school alongside human children while also contributing their people's knowledge to ongoing scientific projects. For the first time since their capture, they had stability and safety. But as watched them begin to build new lives, she felt torn between staying with them and continuing her work with the resistance. The children would benefit from having an adult of their own species nearby, but there were still millions of slaves throughout the galaxy who needed rescue. "You're thinking about leaving," the oldest girl said one evening as they watched the binary sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I have not decided," answered truthfully. "You should go," said firmly. "We are safe here and the humans have promised to protect us, but our people who are still slaves need you more than we do." Looked at the young girl in amazement. Despite everything she had endured, was thinking about others rather than herself. It was a trait that marked the best of culture. "You are wise beyond your years," said. "Our parents taught us that wisdom comes from thinking about the greater good," replied. "Captain saved us, but he cannot save everyone alone. He needs help from people like you." That night made her decision. She would remain with and the resistance, fighting to free others as she had been freed. The children were in good hands with the colonists of New Geneva, and her skills were needed in the larger war against the slave trade. When she told of her choice, he simply nodded and smiled. "I hoped you'd stay," he said. "We've got intelligence about a major slave depot in the Vega system. The operation there is too big for us to handle alone, but I've been in contact with other human resistance cells. We're planning something unprecedented." "What kind of operation?" asked. Smile turned predatory. "We're going to hit 12 slave markets simultaneously across 3 sectors. The hegemony will learn that their property fights back and that humans keep their promises about freedom." As the Defiance prepared to depart, New Geneva felt a deep sense of purpose. She had been saved from slavery by one human's compassion and determination. Now she would help extend that same gift of freedom to countless others. The war against the slave trade was far from over, but for the first time since her world's destruction, believed they could actually win it. Humans, she had learned, were capable of extraordinary things when they decided to fight for justice. And with allies like that, no force in the galaxy could stand against them for long. 1 year after the rescue of the children, the galaxy was beginning to witness something unprecedented. What had started as isolated raids by human resistance cells had grown into a coordinated campaign that was systematically dismantling the hegemony's slave trade infrastructure. Stood on the bridge of the Defiance as it approached the Nexus Prime Station, the largest slave trading facility in known space. Around them, nearly 30 ships formed the assault fleet, some human vessels, others crewed by freed slaves who had chosen to join the fight. The operation they were about to undertake would either cripple the slave trade permanently or result in their complete destruction. "Final weapons check complete," reported from the tactical station. "All ships report ready for engagement." Stood at the command center, reviewing holographic displays showing Nexus Prime's defenses. The station was a fortress built into a massive asteroid, with defensive platforms, patrol fleets, and enough firepower to destroy most attacking forces. But intelligence gathered over months of preparation had revealed a critical weakness. The station's shields have a 30-second gap during shift changes. explained to the fleet commanders via secure communication. Demolition charges will create secondary explosions that should extend that window to 2 minutes, enough time for our assault teams to reach the prison levels. Monitored the communications from her navigation station, coordinating with similar attacks happening simultaneously across the galaxy. In the Vega system, Captain Sarah was leading an assault on the military slave depot. In the sector, Commander John Park was hitting the breeding facilities where the hegemony raised slaves from birth. 12 operations in total, all timed to begin within minutes of each other. The plan was more than just rescue, it was a statement. Today, the galaxy would see that the age of slavery was ending, and that humanity would not tolerate the buying and selling of sentient beings. Said quietly, "Are you ready for this?" She looked at him with eyes that held both determination and sadness. In the months since joining his crew, she had helped rescue thousands of slaves and seen the worst that the galaxy had to offer. But she had also witnessed the incredible power of beings fighting for justice rather than profit. "I am ready, Captain," she replied. "My people's spirits cry out for justice. Today we answer that call." The attack began exactly as planned. Charges detonated throughout the station's power grid, creating cascading failures that brought down the shields for exactly 97 seconds. The assault fleet surged forward, their smaller ships threading through the defensive platforms before the hegemony forces could respond. The Defiance docked at an emergency airlock that had been identified through careful surveillance. Led the first boarding team, her intimate knowledge of hegemony layouts and procedures allowing her to guide them directly to the prisoner holding areas. What they found there, their worst expectations. The prison levels stretched for kilometers through the asteroid's core, with thousands of cages containing beings from hundreds of different species. Many were children, taken from their families to be trained as servants or worse. Others were specialists, scientists, engineers, artists, whose knowledge had made them valuable property. "My God," whispered as they moved through the corridors, "there must be 50,000 prisoners here." Felt her hearts break as she saw the conditions the slaves endured. Many were injured or sick, kept alive only long enough to be sold. The stench of fear and despair was overwhelming, but it also fueled her determination to see every last being freed. "Teams Alpha through Delta begin opening cells in sections 1 through 4, commanded through his communicator. "Teams Echo and Foxtrot secure the medical bays and prepare for casualties. Everyone else established defensive positions around the docking areas." The rescue operation proceeded with mechanical efficiency, but it was far from unopposed. Hegemony security forces poured into the prison levels, determined to protect their valuable inventory. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, with narrow corridors limiting movement and forcing combatants into desperate hand-to-hand combat. Found herself separated from the main team when a blast door slammed shut during a firefight. Alone in a corridor lined with cages, she continued opening locks and guiding prisoners toward the evacuation routes. Many of the slaves were too weak or traumatized to move quickly, forcing her to carry some while encouraging others to find strength they didn't know they possessed. "Please, we must hurry," she told a group of refugees who were hesitating at a corridor junction. "My friends are fighting to keep the path clear, but we cannot hold it forever." As if summoned by her words, a squad of guards rounded the corner ahead of them. Their massive forms filled the passage, and their energy weapons powered up with ominous humming sounds. "Escaped property will return to cages immediately," the lead guard announced in accented galactic standard. "Resistance will result in termination." The freed slaves cowered behind, their brief taste of hope turning to terror. She had a small sidearm that had given her, but she was outnumbered 6-1 by heavily armed opponents. By all rational calculation, she should surrender and hope for mercy. Instead, she thought of her family, dead on a world turned to ash by the hegemony. She thought of the children now safe on New Geneva, building new lives among caring humans. She thought of who had risked everything to buy her freedom from strangers who meant nothing to him. "No," she said simply, raising her weapon. "Never again." The firefight lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. His first shot took down the lead guard, and her tactical training from months with the Resistance allowed her to use the corridor's layout to her advantage. But she was still vastly, and enemy fire forced her to retreat while the freed slaves scattered in panic. then appeared behind the guards like an avenging angel. The human had somehow circled around through maintenance passages, approaching the enemy from an unexpected direction. His assault was swift and merciless. 6 guards were down before they realized they were under attack from a new angle. He called out as the last guard fell, "Are you injured?" She emerged from cover, amazed to find herself unhurt despite the intensity of the battle. "I am well, Captain, but we must move quickly. There are too many prisoners to evacuate through the planned routes." Nodded grimly. Intelligence had indicated 30,000 prisoners, but the actual number was significantly higher. The original evacuation plan would leave thousands behind when hegemony reinforcements arrived. "Change of plans," announced to the entire team. "We're not leaving until every cage is empty. I need you to expand the charges throughout the station's main structure. We're going to bring this entire facility down after we evacuate." "Captain, that will require nearly an hour to place properly," responded. "Intelligence shows hegemony battle cruisers are already en route." "Then we hold them off for an hour," said with the kind of calm determination that had made humans legendary throughout the galaxy. "Signal all ships we're going to full combat deployment." The battle that followed became known throughout the galaxy as the liberation of Nexus Prime. Human warships engaged hegemony cruisers in a running battle through the asteroid field, using superior tactics and desperate courage to hold off forces that outnumbered them 3-1. Meanwhile, on the station itself, teams of humans and freed slaves worked frantically to evacuate tens of thousands of prisoners. Found herself coordinating the evacuation of an entire section, using her knowledge of multiple languages to communicate with slaves from dozens of species. She discovered abilities she never knew she possessed, leadership skills that her people had honored in their ancient traditions. "The transport ships are full," reported Captain Torres from one of the evacuation vessels. "We can't take any more passengers without compromising life support." "Then make another run," replied calmly, even as explosions from the ongoing space battle shook the station around them. "We don't leave anyone behind." As the evacuation continued, word began to spread throughout the galaxy about what was happening. The simultaneous attacks on 12 slave facilities had been noticed by news networks and government officials across multiple sectors. For the first time in decades, someone was seriously challenging the hegemony's control over the slave trade. On worlds throughout the galaxy, beings who had accepted slavery as an unfortunate but unchangeable reality began to reconsider their positions. If a small group of humans and their allies could strike at the heart of the slave trade, perhaps the entire system was not as invincible as it appeared. The last transport ship launched just as charges detonated throughout Nexus Prime's structure. The massive station cracked open like an egg, its destruction visible for light years in all directions. With it died the central hub of slave trading in the known galaxy. But more important than the station's destruction was what had been accomplished. Over 47,000 beings had been freed, the largest single liberation in galactic history. Among them were not just slaves destined for auction, but also the station's administrative staff who had been working under threats to their families, and even some guards who had been pressed into service against their will. As the rescue fleet regrouped in the debris field, stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the aftermath of their victory. Hundreds of ships filled space around them, transports carrying freed slaves to new homes, warships that had fought to make the rescue possible, and even some vessels that had arrived spontaneously to help when word of the battle spread. "Captain," reported the communications officer, "we're receiving messages from across the galaxy. Government officials, resistance groups, even some hegemony facilities are requesting negotiations about prisoner releases." Smiled as he read through the incoming messages. The destruction of Nexus Prime had done more than free 47,000 slaves. It had proven that the slave trade could be defeated, and that proof was spreading hope throughout the galaxy. He said, turning to her, "It looks like we're going to need your navigation skills for a lot more rescue missions. Are you ready to help liberate the rest of the galaxy?" She looked around the bridge at the humans and former slaves who had become her new family. In the year since had purchased her freedom, she had discovered that true liberation meant more than just the absence of chains. It meant having the power to extend that same freedom to others. "I am ready, Captain," she replied. "My people believed that all thinking beings deserved to explore the universe in freedom. Today, we take another step toward making that dream reality. As the Defiance prepared for its next mission, reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been saved from slavery by one human's compassion, but she had learned that true freedom came from fighting to free others. The galaxy was a vast place filled with suffering, but it was also filled with beings like who refused to accept that suffering as inevitable. The slave trade would not end overnight, and there would be many more battles before every being in the galaxy could claim true freedom. But for the first time since the destruction of her, believed that such a future was possible. And that belief, shared now by millions of beings across the galaxy, would prove more powerful than any weapon the hegemony possessed. In the months and years that followed, the liberation movement grew beyond anything its founders had imagined. Former slaves became liberators, peaceful species found their courage to fight injustice, and even some members of the hegemony began to question whether their civilization's foundation was worth defending. The human who had paid 50,000 credits to free one slave had unknowingly purchased the freedom of an entire galaxy. Because sometimes, the most powerful force in the universe is not advanced technology or overwhelming numbers. It is one person's refusal to accept that evil is inevitable. And humans, as the galaxy had learned, were very, very good at refusing to accept the inevitable.